Hello and welcome to Checking the Vitals, a podcast powered by SpecialtyCare. Today our guest is Dr. Poelstra, an orthopedic and neurosurgical spine surgeon at OrthoNorCal. In this conversation, we discuss how an early interest in mechanics led to a lifetime of improving and advancing new technologies for orthopedic surgery, how he and others are working to improve robotic surgery, and what future innovation will be coming to orthopedic surgery in the future. Enjoy the conversation. So one thing I'd like to start out with is sort of what it was that drew you to want to even work in the healthcare space. Obviously, you chose to go into surgery, and then we'll talk about, why that and why you chose to go into the practice you went into. But what was it that made you want to work in the healthcare space in general?
Yeah, so I got drawn into the healthcare space actually through playing tennis. I played tennis at a pretty high level, and one of my tennis coaches, was a cardiology resident.
Oh, really?
So next to his residency in cardiology, he was a tennis trainer, and we worked really well together, and I was mesmerized about what he was doing in the hospital, and I have no family history of any doctors or so in my family, right? Uh-huh. So I learned things about the hospital and patient care from him, and then, one thing led to the next, and I decided to go into medicine.
So you must have been pretty young at that point.
Yeah, I was. I was probably between like 9 and 12 or so during that period of time, and that's, you're very easily influenced, right, from
absolutely.
things. So at that point, that had a big impact on me. I remember that really well.
So you obviously had a lot more schooling left to do, but then you chose to go into medical school after that. So where was that? Where did you go to medical school?
So I grew up in the Netherlands, in Europe, in the northern part of Holland, a town called Groningen.
Okay.
Holland has a large number of people, but a small country, right? So there's 8 medical schools in Holland.
Oh, wow.
And I grew up in one of the towns that had a medical school.
Oh, okay.
So I did high school and college in one, and then was able to go to medical school when I was 18.
Oh, wow.
So I started kind of early, and I stayed in the same town as where I went to my magnet school, I guess, right? For high school in science and technology, and then I went into medical school in the same town. Loved everything about learning to take care of patients, but also the engineering part of it. So already during medical school, I got interested in biomedical engineering, and that rolled into an MD PhD program instead of just an MD program at that point.
Okay, so that's what you sort of left with, was that
Correct.
MD PhD?
Correct.
And then you came stateside for your residency, correct?
Correct.
So. Where did you end up for residency?
Yeah, so I came stateside actually through my PhD program, since I got a grant from the Dutch government to finish my research at a research institute in Northern Virginia. So I was in Reston and Herndon during the initial dot-com boom in 1998.
Oh, wow.
So I finished my research there, defended my PhD successfully, and then I went to Charlottesville in Virginia for my residency in orthopedics. And orthopedics was right up my alley with the PhD research. So we were looking at implant infection and coatings of implants to repel bacteria and so on, because at that point we thought we were going to enter into the post-antibiotic era, because it was kind of scary with these, antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Absolutely.
So I was doing research in that arena. Yeah. And so that was of great interest of the folks at UVA in Charlottesville, and I entered the program there for the next 6 years.
Awesome. So that's quite a commitment with that.
Yeah.
And then you did a post-fellowship, correct?
Yeah. So,
in Philadelphia, right?
Yeah. So I had fantastic training in orthopedics, and I felt that, in spine there was some additional opportunities maybe to train some more.
Sure.
So I almost decided to do a neurosurgery residency also.
Oh, wow.
But then I felt, I wasn't really interested in brain surgery, but I wanted to do a fellowship also with neurosurgery. So I went to Philadelphia to Thomas Jefferson University, and there's a combined fellowship between reconstructive, more orthopedic, and neurosurgery spine. So that's what I did in Philadelphia following my training in Charlottesville.
And is that when you sort of matriculated out west? Or was there
No, I actually stayed on the East Coast for a while. So I went from Philadelphia to Baltimore to a place called Shock Trauma.
Yeah.
Fantastic trauma place, an amazing experience to learn, really anything and everything about spine surgery in extreme conditions, right? Because tons of gunshot wounds, really bad accidents. We had to put people back together that came in 2 pieces and they lived. It was an amazing place. And it really honed my skills as a surgeon.
I'm not sure that that's something you can brush past.
Yeah, I know.
Someone coming in 2 pieces, you putting them back together and then leaving.
It's incredible.
That is
amazing.
Incredible.
Yeah. So that was really allowing me to hone my skills as a surgeon. So after 4 years there, I moved to Destin in Florida.
Right.
It's in
so you were sick
Florida.
of the cold.
Not necessarily. Chopin was great, but it was hard,
Sure.
to combine it with family life and small children and raising a family in Baltimore and all that kind of stuff was hard.
Yeah.
So we went to Northwest Florida and built a spine institute there for the next 10 years out of nothing. It was very, very successful. And from there, eventually, I decided to move out west, and that's how I got to Los Gatos.
Awesome. So that's where you are today.
Correct.
And so it seems like you started out in a time that was, I don't want to say, well, let's just say it this way. A lot of changes have happened in orthopedic surgery across the board in the amount of time that you've been practicing.
Correct.
So let's talk about some of those. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is robotics, because that I think may have been the first thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, the first big sort of revolution that happened in your time period, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely right.
Around what time did robotics come on the scene?
So robotics came on the scene as an extension of something we call navigation.
Mm-hmm.
So navigation is a way to visualize your instruments in relation to the spine or in relation to the skeleton. You can do it for long bones also, on a screen, right? So you look on a screen and then you move your tools and the tools get picked up by an infrared camera. Mm-hmm. So you need to have a consistent line of sight, but then actually you can do things with tools underneath the skin that is not immediately visible to instrument the spine. Say.
Right.
Okay. So it still requires a tremendous amount of skill because you still need to move with your two hands the tools. Mm-hmm. You need to do it in relation to the anatomy that you're not looking at. You look away, right? You look in the distance, and that's not for everybody. But for the people that liked this, it gave them an advantage of doing more percutaneous type surgery, right? So you don't have to make a big incision.
Right.
More as well
invasive.
As correct, exactly. As well as that you had a lot of X-ray reduction. Because X-ray was necessary before to visualize the anatomy underneath the skin.
Yeah.
And now you could take imaging studies in the operating room, then the imaging machine went away, and you could continue to operate with this navigation equipment.
Sure.
But again, it required you to target the anatomy, which is sometimes hard. Mm-hmm. So then early 2000s already, the early robots started to come. And these were very simple machines. They were sort of the size of a Coke can, if you will.
Wow.
And they had extensions you could attach to it. And there were various companies doing it, but the Mazor company out of Israel was the most successful to push that technology forward, ultimately leading to a device called the Renaissance. And it was literally like the size of a Coke can. And you attached it to the patient on a frame. And as soon as that came about, I got very interested in it. So this is like 2010, 2012 or so. It took us a little time to get it in the hospital, but I felt that getting into robotics early with relatively simple robots would make me ready for when the bigger robots would be coming that undoubtedly would take over parts of the procedure. Because if you look at the world around you, I mean, all kids' toys now are pretty much, robotically driven. Most kids have drones. All the stuff we drive in nowadays, right, is put together by robots. Supply chains from companies like Amazon and so on, everything is done robotically. So undoubtedly that will come in medicine.
Yeah.
Medicine is traditionally slow to adopt and adapt because we are comfortable with what we know. It took us, say, 18 years after high school to finally get to the operating room table, right? So why would we suddenly embrace technology that might displace us, right? So that's a big hurdle.
Sure.
That's a big hurdle.
Yeah.
But I felt early on that, let me learn how these things work. So then I'm going to be ready for the next wave. And I absolutely loved it when they came onto the scene. Yeah. I'm a bit of a tinkerer. I was a car mechanic for a while. So
well, you sort of have that engineering in your background anyway.
Yeah.
So it's sort of is right in your wheelhouse from school. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was very impressed with the engineering that went on behind it. And I really felt that, that type of technology would make it easier for surgeons that would have a tough time during surgery, and it would make good surgeons faster. So I felt across the board that was going to be an advantage. And then after I did my first 20 or 30 cases, I came up with a way to put that robot on a patient while they were still on the side. So sometimes we do surgery not in a prone position on the patient, right, where they're face down, but they lay on their side. And before, you always had to turn the patient and then attach either the robot or your navigation equipment to the back of the patient. So I actually 3D printed stuff at home to be able to keep that small robot that we had back then, to keep that on the side of the patient and be able to operate that way. And then started my drawings for like the bigger robots that were developed afterwards. And I was very fortunate that some of the engineers from that company were interested in what I was doing. And then we co-developed the next waves of robotics that are now in the operating room.
That's awesome. So you were so much in on the ground floor of robotics that you actually had a hand in developing the next generation of robots.
Yeah, the clinical application of it was fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there are a lot of benefits for using robots in these. I mean, you mentioned a lot of them, like just helping with the navigation for minimally invasive, and the patient outcomes are better for that.
Yeah.
Is there a extra licensing a doctor has to go through to be able to use robots in the machine?
That's a good question. Yeah, there is actually, so initially when robots came, nobody really know what box to put them in, so to speak, right? Yeah. But then on the heels of the Intuitive Corporation here from Sunnyvale, right, from the Da Vinci robot,
right.
They got a lot farther along in the soft tissue robot space.
Okay.
So there were special credentialing requirements for physicians to be able to use the robot. So you had to have, so many hours of training, you had to have so many cases under your belt before you were allowed to fly solo, and until that point you needed a proctor, and there were requirements put on the company to help with this. And on the heels of that, we do the same thing now in spine, and also the same thing in general orthopedics. They have a joint robot called the Mako robot, and then there's some other companies that have also joint robots, and they're required to do the same type of training and then proctoring of surgeons before they're allowed to do things on their own.
Interesting. You want to make sure someone knows how to sort of fly before they get behind
them. We always say jokingly, a fool with a tool is still a fool. And that's true, right? If you don't know how to operate the machine, then with the machine you can still hurt people. And I think what the patients need to understand is that it's not just that, we sit back and we smoke a cigarette while the operating room gets handled by the robot,
Yeah, you're still doing it.
I mean, we do it together, right? The robot is for trajectory guidance.
Right.
But I think the main advantage is, robots are extremely accurate. So we have greater accuracy.
Right.
We have greater reproducibility from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., right? We get tired at some point, and sometimes errors occur. And then the main difference is that if the robot takes over salient parts of this targeting, which is relatively stressful if you have to do it yourself, then you can devote that stress to other things in the operating room. Meaning you can be much more gentle with the nerves, you can work with the scar around the spinal cord, you can do a better, what we call a decompression, because you didn't have to use any of your cognitive skills for the instrumentation with the rods and the screws and so on.
Right.
You plan your surgery predictably beforehand, so 90% of the work is done before the patient goes under anesthesia. So that helps tremendously, making you a better surgeon at the other aspects of surgery that are probably far more important than exactly where the screws and the rods are.
Right.
But that's suddenly sort of taken over. So that makes the biggest difference, I think, for us.
Well, I mean, when you're doing spine surgery, it is sort of a high-risk gamble. I don't mean gamble, maybe a high-risk game, maybe is a better way of saying it. Because you really only have one spine, and the spine connects a lot of things together in the body, and if anything goes wrong,
I mean, you only have one chance, right? I mean, that's the thing. If you do inadvertently something wrong with the hardware and you wrap up a nerve or you bump into the spinal cord with a screw, I mean, there's no way back. It's not like, 15 minutes from now the patient's going to do better or so, right? I mean, then it's not necessarily game over, but there is a irreversible change.
Yeah.
So those are, I guess, the red rule events, the definite no-no events, right? Yeah. So what robots do, they reduce what we call the outliers, because we all operate in a bell curve, if you will, right? Sure. Sometimes we're a little bit to the left of the median, sometimes we're a little bit to the right, but you don't want to be outside of that bell curve where you have these absolute outliers happen. And if you look at the early data on robotics, that's what it did initially. It reduced the frequency and the severity of outliers. And now we are bringing that bell curve even narrower because we get more surgeons better to do their surgeries across sort of this median border, which is good to excellent.
Right.
So that helps a lot, I think.
Yeah, so it's just robotics. Sort of making everyone more precise.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about the sort of the next generation of robots that are coming out. I assume sort of now and maybe for the past 5 years or so. Yeah. Is that right on the timeline?
Yeah, correct.
So what are some of the new evolutions other than just navigation that the first ones had? Yeah. That you sort of helped develop? Yeah,
so the initial robots were relatively unsteady. I guess they were smaller. You could potentially push them out of position, and it depended a lot more on the operator to make sure that the robot worked well in conjunction with you. Okay. Now the newer robots are much more stable. They're much stiffer arms. Some of the robots are actually industrial robots that have been borrowed to do spine things. And the benefit of that is now we get comfortable with what we call trajectory guidance, right? The robot moves and then it has what we call an end effector, and it allows us to put screwdrivers through it and so on to target the anatomy very exactly. But what robots are going to do eventually is allow us to put potentially a drill or some kind of cutting tool at the end of the robot.
So mounting it to the robot
Correct.
itself.
And then the robot can, to your point, right, start to do autonomous things.
Yeah.
We're still guiding the robot, planning the trajectory and so on, but the robot is actually executing it, again, to take away stress from us so we can follow things a little bit more carefully and to be more consistent. It requires a different skill of the robot. The robot needs to be super precise, right? It all needs to be sub-millimeter accuracy, if you will. From a regulatory standpoint, this is interesting too, because the FDA is concerned, right, when robots start to do things on their own. And let's be honest, we are a little bit too, because if the robot suddenly can do things,
I was thinking,
you could hire, a guy who's right out on parole and give him the joystick and have him do for, healthcare systems where the payer and the payee are the same. I mean, what prevents them from just having people do simple surgeries that have not a lot of medical background because it's just a procedure where the robot needs to be followed?
Right.
So that's like, very far-fetched maybe, but I mean, we want to be in charge of this, right?
Yeah,
I don't want to be overrun by the next wave of robots. I think nobody else but busy clinicians know better what robots should be doing. So we need to lead the charge together with the companies and the engineers and the regulatory folks to say, hey, you know what, this is the safe way to advance medical care. Because there's no doubt that we're going to do better for patients with the use of the robot in the operating room. We just have to be cautious about how to introduce the robot and what we are going to allow robotics to do in the future.
I mean, all that innovation is in service of the patient, better patient outcomes. I mean, we're so far away from the days of wake-up tests in between, the evolution of sort of IO&M to do that sort of work. And so all of that isn't just in service of
Correct. And so you could imagine that, in the end, right, together with the intraoperative neuromonitoring clinicians, that they're tied into your robotic technology, that robot technology is tied into your drills and your other tools. And when you reach certain points, helped by the clinician who's monitoring the nerve tissue, the drill automatically stops, that is guided by the robot and so on. So this is an interplay between multiple people in the operating room, and we might be championing this, but I think we have to let the technology work for us.
Absolutely.
To eventually what you said, right? The patient comes first to make the patient better with, less soft tissue trauma and less comorbidity from the surgery.
So in about 10 years, it went from just sort of navigation, robotics did, went from just navigation to sort of navigation and guidance, for lack of a better term. And how long do you think it'll be until they start actually attaching a drill to it? And is that something that you're already working on?
So secretly under like double secret probation, we're like doing some of this already, right?
Okay.
So there's all of us. I mean, we're all sort of tinkerers, right? So we've put like drills on the robot and very carefully let the robot do things while we're very much in charge of like every millimeter that happens. But there's a lot of development going on by multiple companies to make this truly sort of an automated, integrated procedure. And I think that's where competition is great, right? Because everybody needs to get a little bit better, up their ante a little bit, eventually to the benefit of the patient and to the benefit of us in the operating room. But starting with like cutting of parts of the bone, parts of the spine for purpose of a decompression is next. Then placing instrumentation directly. I mean, there's really no purpose that the robot guides me to where I need to be, and then I still have to drill and put the screw in. I mean, the robot can just hold the screwdriver and is much more accurate than me with my wrist trying to make perfect circles, to put the screws in. But again, this is sort of the next evolution where, if something doesn't feel right, I now stop what I'm doing. We have to teach the robot through machine learning, right? Artificial intelligence, to know when things are perfect and when things may not feel exactly right. So the robot also stops the drill at the time when I would have stopped the drill. Right? So that's what we're working on.
To build that sort of machine learning system, that requires a lot of data.
Correct.
So where do you get data sets to teach that to a machine?
Yeah, so that's difficult, right? So data set is like, similar to facial recognition, right? It took a long time because every face is just a 1x, right? So if we're somehow able to allow the robot to get a lot of information during one drill pass, that we assist the robot, and during say force feedback and some other things associated with knowing where the drill is at the time when the drilling occurs. If we split that up in thousands of different variables, we can teach the robot much faster through a machine learning process to know what feels right and what doesn't feel right. So that's where, the engineers and writing code comes in play here.
Interesting. I wondered if, you and a bunch of other people or surgeons that are sort of on this pushing of innovation, like if you shared the data that you guys have and sort of try to get to the biggest data set, or is it a race and you're trying to be the first one there, so you're trying to keep the data because you have the best data?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a healthy race.
Okay.
We all share, of course, what we know and how we do things
best
on the
practices.
podium. So there's a lot of things that are out in public domain, so to speak.
Right.
But of course, there's proprietary things that each company sort of has. Mercedes would not share with VW what they're doing to build their car a little bit more efficient and so on, right? I mean, this is sort of the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I mean, the data that we have comes out rapidly. Everybody's proud of how we're advancing the field. So everybody wants to write abstracts and papers to get onto the podium. So there's a lot of stuff in public domain.
Yeah.
And then ultimately it comes down to the engineers to execute the next step. But that's usually behind closed doors.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so the data sets they're talking about is like patient outcomes and patient data, like tremendous volumes of, what do we do surgery for? What is the outcome? What are the true indications? All this kind of stuff. And then patient outcome is eventually going to drive that. And it'd be wonderful to know that and tie that to a registry of what we're actually doing as surgeons. So hopefully the world will open up.
Yeah, absolutely.
More and more from a data standpoint.
Awesome. So after robotics, what is the next wave of innovation that's going to be hitting sort of your field?
Yeah. So I think what is going to happen with our field is that that robots will go one way, where there's a possibility to do very advanced things in a semi or maybe fully automated fashion. But if you think about spine surgery and orthopedic surgery in general is moving to the ASC. Right? So the ambulatory surgery center may not have, say, $1 million or $2 million to buy like the next piece of robotics. However, surgeons have gotten used to in the hospital having really intelligent equipment to help them be more efficient, fewer revisions, fewer complications, and less comorbidity for the patient. So taking a case to the surgery center should not then result in a surgeon having to do everything alone again, because then it's sort of counterproductive, right? I mean, it's cool and sexy to do it in the ASC, but if you don't deliver the same level of care, because it depends again on that one guy and not so much on your equipment that helps you to give the patient a better outcome, we are looking at augmented reality, and I think that's going to really trailblaze the outpatient surgery setting for pedicle screw fixation.
So when I hear augmented reality, I think video games. So explain to me what augmented reality is in your space.
So augmented reality is, it's similar to what I just explained, right? If you have your navigation before, you look at your screen away from you while you hold instruments in front of you targeting the spine. Now imagine if that screen was projected onto your retina via a headset, almost like the virtual reality type goggles, but you can actually look through those goggles. It's transparent glass that still has a projector onto your eye. So you look down onto the patient and it's literally like X-ray vision. You look down at the skin, but all you see is the bony spine. You see your tools in place, and in full reality, you can actually follow your tools down to the spine. You can do exactly the same operation, but now you look down at the patient. And for a lot of people that had a hard time integrating what they were doing in the field in front of them while looking away on a screen in a wall,
I would have a hard time with that too.
Right? It's like playing Frogger. Some people were good at it. Some other people had a hard time with that.
Absolutely.
So now, if you look at Frogger, you look straight down to your fields. You can use the tools, same as what you normally would do with drills and screwdrivers and so on, but it's right in front of you. And it is going to take up a lot of surgeons' interest, I think. And it's really the wave of the future, especially initially for the ASC setting, and then also for relatively smaller cases in the hospital, I think.
So how far away is that, or is that something you guys are already using now in the OR?
I was fortunate to work with the percutaneous, the application in the minimally invasive fashion. So we just wrote an article up, and the system got FDA approved just at the end of December.
And that takes time, right?
That's a very lengthy process, and it requires rigorous study of the accuracy and the reliability, and it needs to be done in multiple hands. So there's a whole protocol for this, but placing hundreds and hundreds of screws eventually within less than 3 millimeters of deviation and less than 3 degrees of angular deviation. That's what it leads to. And if you show that, well, then you get approval. So that system got approved, and now it's being built, and hopefully next month or so it's going to be available.
Oh, that quickly?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty quick. But it's a roadway again of the past 8 years. Right? It's a very lengthy roadway, but hopefully in April it's going to be available, and I can't wait to start using it clinically. I've done a lot of cadavers with it, and it's spectacular. So I'm very excited about that.
Is that the sort of FDA process? You have to sort of prove on cadavers that it works before they approve it to be used in a on
Correct.
a live patient.
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So augmented reality is going to be in the next month or so.
Yeah, correct.
Is there anything?
Yeah. So then I think what this is tied to also is that what we do for patients still depends on mostly implantation of materials, right? If you look at what has happened with implants throughout time, we've gotten better at making things for patients with respect to pedicle screws and rods, and we've used some different materials.
Sure.
But we're still, as engineers, upheld by limitations that material properties may have. So if you look at materials that are commonly used in spine, we have some stainless steel, then we have a lot of titanium, and we have for longitudinal rods, for strength purposes, we use cobalt chromium. Unfortunately, there are some downsides to all of these materials. The main thing is that strength-wise and durability-wise, like how long do they uphold if the fusion, like the bony connection, might not set in, right? If you wiggle them around, eventually anything breaks. Metal is subject to fatigue, right? So if we had a material that was much more fatigue resistant, we could potentially make implants smaller. We could offer patients implants with much greater longevity while not compromising the construct that we're building. So fortunately, just since April last year, for the first time in about half a century, we now have a new metal we can use in spine as well as in orthopedics, actually, and it's called molybdenum rhenium, or MORE, like more in short. So molybdenum rhenium is a very pure metal, so it only consists of molybdenum and rhenium, and they're very stable metals, so they don't have trace metals in there that other things may need that can leach out of metal. For example, nickel. A lot of people have nickel allergies, right? So cobalt chromium has to have nickel in it to stabilize the alloy. So nickel allergies are an issue. For imaging purposes, when you have iron in a metal, which you do for some of these things, then you have imaging artifacts on the MRI scanner. You have imaging artifacts on the CT scanner. And molybdenum rhenium doesn't need any of this stuff. And in addition to that, it's 2 to 3 times stronger than cobalt chromium, and it's 4 times more durable.
So just so I know, how long does a typical implant last? Before you had the MOR metal, how long would a typical implant last?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you have to understand, we put implants in the body, in this case, to fuse the spine together, right? So we put bone graft in and cages and other things, and then we have a tension band that we put in with either titanium or cobalt chromium, or in some cases stainless steel implants. And they all have their own fatigability. So if the bone potentially would not fuse across, and there consistently is a wiggle, and it depends on, patient size and how much wiggle there is and so on. But in general, say after 10 million cycles, the rod breaks, or the screw head breaks off of the screw stem, the screw shank. Those kinds of things happen, right? Something will fail. Now, if you, in a patient, had a lot of stress on the hardware because of the correction that you did, for example, right? Patient was first leaning very far forward. You do a big correction with osteotomies and other complex things to get the patient back upright. That patient's spine may want to go back to that original position. So the stresses on the hardware are incrementally greater. So they might fail after like 2 million cycles, and the bone in that period of time would not even have had a chance to fuse together. So instead of 2 rods, then we put 4 rods in. Sometimes we even put 6 rods in, because we have to get more strength, and the material properties demand more rods because the 2 rods we normally used weren't going to be strong enough. The more and more metal you put in, the more and more you compromise the patient's immunity.
Sort of the higher the risk.
The more patients hurt, because there's a lot more space occupying stuff in their back. So imagine if you had the same material property as a 4-rod construct in just a 2-rod construct with tiny pedicle screw heads, and you would have twice the run out or durability of that system. I mean, we could certainly do very complex operations through much smaller incisions, much more soft tissue sparing for the patient, and the likelihood it would break is still much less. So when we look at the molybdenum rhenium implants, and I have a little example here.
Absolutely.
So if you look at a conventional system, you have a pedicle screw here with a rod that is typically 5.5 millimeter or 6 millimeter in diameter, and then the screw head is about 15 millimeters or so, because it has to have some tissue, some metal around it to be able to hold that rod and be strong enough.
Yeah.
Now imagine that footprint compared to the same system made out of molybdenum rhenium. I mean, when the screw head is like half the size,
yeah, it's
the
much
screw
smaller.
shank is still the same because you still need to have good fixation in the patient's bone, right? But then the rod is only like 4 millimeters, and it surpasses in strength that large rod that you see here next to it.
So the smaller one is actually stronger.
The smaller rod is like 3 times as strong.
Oh, wow.
So there's a tremendous benefit to having less volume in your body while having still much greater strength and durability.
And this is something you're currently using in patients?
Correct, yeah. So we're using this now for about a year. And then the other benefit is that this metal has no what we call ion release. So we talked about nickel and iron before,
absolutely.
right? That leaches from other implants across the board. This has no ion release at all. And the wear, meaning when things rub back and forth against each other, right? The wear characteristics are at least 100-fold better than the next best system out of cobalt, chromium, or titanium.
Right.
So you don't want to have these particles floating around in your body. I mean, these are tiny, tiny spicules of metal, right? But they are known to cause some inflammatory responses.
Yeah.
They're known to have caused patients what we call this post-laminectomy back pain, this sort of unexplained back pain. Everything looks good on the picture, but they still hurt and we don't understand. And then if you eventually open these people up, you see these darker areas of this filing type material.
So it's like metal shavings?
Correct. Even if patients are fused, there are still these very, very small little metal particles.
And
it's like dust.
Just because they're moving, the body moves.
Correct.
I mean, it's gonna,
exactly. There's living, breathing, getting up out of bed in the morning, bending down, that kind of stuff. That still causes these particles, this powder, to come from these past systems. So on all areas that we've studied this, and this is like literally a decade-long project for tens and tens of millions of dollars through the University of Georgia Tech, to be able to get this metal and look at it and say, hey, is this indeed better? It comes originally out of the aerospace industry. So it's a super alloy, is what we call it, used for super strength requirements on things like the space shuttle, SpaceX, those kinds of things.
So things have to be super strong, but also small.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So can I ask, as far as, and maybe it hasn't been out long enough, but how do you compare patient outcomes to the older metals to this new one? Yeah,
so that's a good point. So the main data that we have on the metal is like from all of this bench testing that has been done, right? About wear particles and all that kind of stuff. We don't have long enough data in patients yet, but I can tell you that, before when we had to make incisions in the patient to put the implants in, even if you did a percutaneous, like minimally invasive incision, right? You still needed to make an incision that was maybe about 18 to 20 millimeters to get the screw head in. Now I make an incision that's not even 15 millimeters. And once these patients get up in the recovery room already, they almost look like patients that did not have hardware placed, but they just had what we call a decompression. So my patients that have 1 or 2 level fusions with really small implants, they behave like patients that did not have a fusion. So they have much less pain, they're much less comfortable moving around, because you have to imagine their muscle tissue doesn't have to rub over these large pedicle screw heads that, up to this day, I mean, this was as good as we could make it, right? This is as small and still strong enough as we could make it. And now the stuff we have is literally 50% less prominent. So obviously the muscle tissue moves much more smoothly over top of it. And people immediately after surgery have the biggest benefit.
So you sort of see them immediately walking around, or I guess it depends on what kind of surgery they had, but they're quicker to walk around.
And they're more comfortable. So all my patients walk across the board within 5 hours from surgery. Whether we cut them in half and put them back together, or whether we do simple, straightforward.
Like that's a normal thing. That's not a normal thing.
Well, when we do big surgeries, right, and get people from leaning all the way forward or sideways with scoliosis, getting them upright. The sooner you get them up and moving, the better it is. But putting a lot of very bulky hardware in makes it really hard for patients to be compliant with it. They don't like it. Now with this smaller stuff, I mean, they get out of bed and they actually get a tremendous amount of confidence already, that they actually feel pretty darn good, although they just had a massive operation 4 or 5 hours earlier, and they're standing on their feet next to the stretcher while they move themselves to their hospital bed and then to the bathroom overnight already. So motion is lotion, I always say, motion is lotion, and implant-wise, less is more. So that's what we're trying to do.
So is there any move to make what is now less even lesser?
That's a good point.
Are you still trying to move in that direction? Like, can you get much smaller? Because as I look at this, I mean, you said the screw can't be much smaller.
Correct.
Or can it? Let's think about that.
With a different design,
Yeah.
the screw head we can potentially make smaller. But there's one other benefit I want to touch on with this, and that is that more and more interbody implants, like cages, are now no longer made out of a plastic material, right? But they're made out of a titanium material,
right?
Because titanium has the ability for bone to grow onto it, especially with some surface modifications and maybe 3D printing and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But it all depends on the wettability of the surface. Like how likely does a water droplet want to sort of lay down on the surface versus it sort of beating up, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a piece of plastic and you put water on it, right, you see it sort of beating up, right? If you have even a stainless steel pan at home, it lays a little flatter. Titanium does better than that, and that is the same with cells that might go on top of it. But the molybdenum rhenium material is even another 40% more wettable than titanium is. So the incorporation of implants we make that go into the interbody space, cages and so on, the ability for them to incorporate with bone and bone cells growing onto it is another 40% better than titanium.
So the more wettable it is, the better it adapts to being in the body? Is that what I'm...
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly. Because the body repels things that look like a Lego block, right? Because it's plastic and water doesn't want to attach to it.
Right.
And we used to have a lot of interbody implants that were made like that. Now with titanium it's better, more wettable, but molybdenum rhenium is again another 30 to 40% better than that. So we're very excited about having 3D structures printed off this material because we need, again, because of the strength, very little metal. So there's a lot of space open for bone to grow into, and the bone loves to grow onto this material to incorporate it. So we talked earlier about, what if somebody has a big correction and they start wiggling around because their body may want to go back to that old position.
Yeah.
It's a race between implant failure and bony fusion.
Yeah.
So if we now have a metal that in the back with less metal is still stronger, so it won't fail, and the fusion sets up faster because of the 3D printed molybdenum rhenium implants, because they just are much more liked by the body, and the bone cells rush towards them to incorporate them, we most certainly will have a greater chance of getting that patient to fuse before any of the implants fail. Yeah. So it's an interplay between that tension band, less volume of that, and better interbody grafts and cages to allow the patient to fuse in that new upright position.
So are there any things that we haven't touched on here that you see coming down sort of the pike for your, surgical space? Or are you just sort of on the cutting edge of all of it?
Yeah. So the things that we're doing right now is from a reconstruction standpoint is like top of the line. I mean, this is like the pinnacle of where sort of the industry is, right? I think motion sparing is very important. There's a lot of people that early on may have a soft tissue destruction of the disc, but they still have good joints that allow the spine to move. So I think that we're going to see an uptick in motion sparing technologies, disc replacements and so on, that have much greater longevity, that also have a bit of a sort of buffer inside as opposed to just being so to speak, a metal and plastic ball that move together. I mean, so far they have done pretty well. But I think what normal discs do, right, they have a little bit of like vertical axis buffering, sort of like a sponge. Yeah. Now there are discs coming out that have that incorporated. And I think that's going to take flight and is going to hopefully spare a lot of people from having to have a fusion, because we can restore their normal biomechanics a lot better than we were able to do before. So that's an important point also, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Poelstra, thank you so much for letting me sort of borrow you for an hour today and talk about all this stuff. It's very fascinating.
Sure, yeah, it was my pleasure, and happy to do it again as we embark on new endeavors in spine surgery. Thank you so much.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good.
Absolutely.
Awesome.